He dragged the black teenager out of the courtroom like a trash bag through a busy market, right in front of the silent court, waiting for the gavel to fall. The boy had no sentence, no trial pending, only contempt granted as authority and a gaze lifted, unknowing of fear. But what the man didn't know was who the boy's mother was. She stepped in, and it took only one sentence for the entire legal system to fall silent. They thought this was a simple case. They forgot that when the CIA walks in through the front door, no one has the authority to proceed. What state are you in? Watch until the end to understand why a hallway can become a real courtroom, and why this time they won't get away. Zion Mercer entered the courthouse that morning with a quietness unnoticed by anyone, as if he already knew his presence was unwelcome. His old shirt had been ironed the night before, his faded jeans patched once under the left knee, and the worn shoes his mother left him 2 years prior still fit tightly despite his feet growing more than half a size. He didn't look at anyone as he walked past the rows of seats. The only thing Zion did was keep his eyes fixed on the floor, where thin cracks ran along the white tiles like temporary stitches holding together something long broken. On the other side of the courtroom, Gavin Holt stood with arms crossed, a long-serving lieutenant known throughout the neighborhood for his stiff walk, as if he embodied righteousness and had the power to make anyone stop in their tracks just by suspicion. When Zion passed by, Gavin didn't need to ask his name. The way the young black boy walked, his slightly bent back, neck neither lowered nor raised, for Holt, that was enough. His gaze swept over Zion, like inspecting a defective item. Without any cue from anyone, Holt nodded subtly, signaling to a nearby assistant as if the boy had been confirmed exactly what he suspected, a seed that needed to be controlled. Zion moved to the defendant's row, sitting down as if he already knew how everything would unfold. When the judge entered, everyone stood as a reflex, but Gavin remained still, eyes locked on Zion, hand resting on the belt where his handcuffs hung. While the judge was flipping through pages, Gavin approached Zion slowly as if each step was part of a mandatory ritual. "Stand up," he said, not loudly but loud enough for everyone to hear. Zion looked up toward the voice, not out of arrogance, but counting breaths to keep his hands from trembling. Holt leaned closer, voice dropping but sharper than a razor blade. "I told you to stand up." Zion stayed seated, eyes leaving the floor for the first time to meet the face of the man trying to turn him into a shadow. His reply was soft, but hit the dark core of Holt's soul. "Your eyes see nothing but skin color, don't they?" Gavin clenched his jaw, eyes glinting not with anger, but with desire. The desire for power to openly punish, without concealment, without legal cause. He grabbed Zion's shoulder, yanking him up so hard the chair behind fell over with a crash echoing through the courtroom. The judge looked up but said nothing. No one intervened. Everyone present seemed to silently agree. This was nothing new. Gavin dragged Zion from the chair as if he were an object to be removed from the frame. The jerk twisted Zion's left arm awkwardly. His shoulder twisted, collar pulled askew to reveal a faded bruise beneath the collarbone. The scraping sound of the chair sliding on stone made some turn their heads, but no one spoke. Zion leaned into the pull, mouth slightly open as if to speak, then closed it, eyes meeting the space before him where unfamiliar faces pretended not to see. The courtroom door had just closed behind the judge when Gavin spun Zion toward the hallway, his other hand yanking handcuffs off his belt. The lock clicked sharply, echoing in the silence filled only by leather shoes on stone and low breaths of the waiting crowd. "Time you learn to respect your elders," Gavin said, then bent close to Zion's ear, whispering like giving orders to an animal, "especially those who don't need orders to teach you." Zion did not react. He turned his face aside, his eyes drifting to the waiting area gradually filling with people again. An elderly white woman clutching a file sat beside a 10-year-old boy who stared at him intently. The boy's eyes held no contempt, no pity, only one thing, a question. In that moment, Zion wanted to say something to make the boy understand he was not a criminal, not the villain the movies and headlines had painted him to be. But his throat burned from the grip on his shoulder, and all that escaped was breath tinged with metal. Gavin pushed Zion down onto a cold, curved metal bench along the hallway, the edge digging into his spine. Next to them was a frosted window pane where light streamed in but revealed nothing outside. "Sit still. I have papers to write. You're not allowed to ask anything," Gavin growled, turning his back and signaling Duke Morgan, who stood near the intake desk. Duke glanced up from his phone, shrugged, and stepped closer, his hand still tucked in his pocket. Zion glanced over. His eyes held no anger but a cold, stone-like sarcasm. "Do I look like I'm talking?" he whispered, loud enough for Duke to hear. Without waiting for a response, Zion fixed his gaze on Gavin, now writing on a scrap of paper a few steps away. He spoke again, clearer this time, his tone sharp but not bitter. "You look at a black man and decide guilt, decide prison. You look and take that as reason to drag him away." Gavin paused, squinting. He didn't reply but stepped forward slowly, measuring each step to intimidate. When he was less than an arm's length away, he bent down, gripping the bench where Zion sat, his voice dropping to a hateful whisper. "You think you're better than anyone in this court? You think your face is clean enough to preach to me?" Zion didn't look at him. He exhaled slowly and repeated the exact words, this time not whispering. "For you, skin color must be the first reason to be jailed, right?" This time, Duke spoke first, trying to calm things down. "All right, he knows to shut up now. No need to get closer." But Gavin stood still for a few more seconds, his eyes locked on Zion as if his very presence was a personal challenge Gavin had never beaten. He turned away, but his contemptuous smile lingered, hovering in the thick air of a courthouse built to uphold justice. Yet now, that place had become a stage for humiliation legalized by uniform and badge. And there in the middle, Zion sat silent, his back pressed against the cold metal bar, eyes never leaving the gaze of the boy, still sitting at the far end of the hall. Zion's wrist stung sharply as the metal cuff closed tightly around the small bone, the click echoing in the room that had yet to begin the trial. Gavin shoved him forward, pressing his knee into Zion's back like a warning, as if his silence alone was already a crime. Behind them, whispers skimmed over the rows of seats, some craning their necks to watch, others bowed their heads to their phones. No one intervened or objected. The judge had not yet returned, leaving only the sound of turning pages and footsteps echoing from the hallway. Zion did not struggle. He closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing the heat rising in his chest, then opened them, stood straight with his hands cuffed behind his back and chin lifted just enough to see the pale fluorescent ceiling like diseased skin. Gavin nudged him gently toward the door but paused, waiting for a signal from Duke. Across the room, Duke Morgan leaned against a column, arms crossed, eyes indifferent, as if watching the final act of a repeated script. He chuckly, voice dripping with sarcasm. "He looks at me like his mom's the CIA director." Those words slid through the room like a silent slap, met with neither laughter nor protest. Gavin smirked, as if the story had just picked up a few humorous pages. Zion glanced over his shoulder without arguing or showing any emotion in his eyes. He had heard such remarks too many times before, sometimes harsher, sometimes softer, but all with the same purpose, to remind him he wasn't protected by the system. Today, this room with its high ceiling, lacquered wooden columns, and gilded badges was becoming the place that legitimized that mockery. Gavin pulled him forward with steady, confident steps, as if leading a criminal out of a sentencing chamber. But there was no sentence. Zion had not uttered a false word, not committed any act defined as resistance, had only sat quietly waiting for the law to speak. Yet the first sound to break the silence was the metal clinking against bone. Through the hallway glass, the morning mist began to settle, light sparkling in streaks across the tiled floor. Gavin pushed the door open, nodded, and Duke stepped forward. Together, they forced Zion down a narrow corridor leading to the preliminary interrogation area. Suddenly, all sounds behind them seemed blocked out, as if the entire courtroom swallowed his presence whole. Zion stopped looking around. He only listened to his steady breathing, counted his steps, the sharp scrape of metal wrists meeting, and the words lingering in his mind without need for repetition. "Your mom's the CIA director, huh?" But Duke was wrong, not because he misjudged, but because he had unwittingly opened a door that even he was unqualified to close. Behind that door was neither a weak mother weeping nor a woman kneeling before the law begging for mercy. The wrists in pain from the cuffs might remain silent, but Zion's eyes did not. They met Gavin's and Duke's faces whenever he turned, unwavering, unseeking pity. These were not eyes pleading for help. They were the eyes of someone who knew full well that nothing had truly begun, and when it did, it would not end as they wished. The cold, white stone walls of the hallway reflected everything starkly. Gavin and Duke's shadows stretched long across the wall, intersecting with Zion's thin form pressed between them. Under the harsh, bluish-white ceiling lights, every movement became stiff, the air taut like a thin pane of glass ready to shatter. The sound of shoes hitting the floor repeated, dry and merciless. Each time Zion was redirected, his shoulder grazed the polished stone wall, leaving a faint, damp mark like water traces left by a living body dragged along. The white backdrop, which should have symbolized purity and justice, now served as the stage for oppression carried out smoothly, like an office routine. A man from the gallery stepped out into the hallway, glancing at the scene before him, still holding a cup of hot coffee. His gaze paused for exactly 2 seconds before moving on, leaving no questions behind. Perhaps he had witnessed this more times than he cared to remember. Perhaps, for him, this was just another ordinary morning in a place called the Center of Justice. The door behind cracked open, revealing a patch of dim light and the fragmented sound of a child's voice, thin as a needle slicing through the thick velvet draped over everything. A little girl stood close to her mother, clutching the edge of her shirt as if afraid that letting go would make her vanish into the dense air inside. She had wide eyes, neatly tied hair, and an expression that would make any decent adult lower their gaze. She asked, her voice soft as breath, clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, "They're catching the bad guy, right, Mom?" The woman was silent. Her hand tightened around her daughter's, her eyes flickered, then drifted away from the scene in the hall as if it were an image best left untouched. That question hung in the air, pressing straight into the truth the whole room was trying to avoid. A child needed a frame of reference for right and wrong, and instead, she received a silence admitting that adults were no longer sure of anything. Zion turned his head, catching that gaze for the briefest moment. A quiet pain crept along his spine as he realized he had just become a child's first lesson in the imperfection of justice. Not because he chose that role, but because someone had pushed him into the center of the stage. He inhaled, eyes unblinking, holding his legs steady as Gavin placed a hand on his shoulder and led him a few steps closer to the side door. Behind him, a small wall-mounted camera kept recording, its red light blinking steadily like a mechanical heartbeat. He knew someone might someday replay this video, analyze every movement to determine fault, to compare, to reason, but in that moment, every machine became meaningless. What played out in that girl's eyes surpassed anything a lens could capture. It was not just documenting an abuse of power. It was recording the moment a child first learned that truth could be dragged down a hallway and handcuffed before it ever had a chance to speak. Gavin shoved Zion toward the iron bench, bolted to the stone wall, grabbed his collar, and pressed his shoulder down with enough force to slam his back against the rigid curved support. The metallic clang rang harshly, blending with the heavy breaths of the handcuffed teenager, causing a few passers-by to hesitate briefly before continuing, as if those sounds weren't loud enough to warrant a reaction. "This is where you'll sit forever," Gavin said coldly, each word carved into Zion's ear like a nail rather than a sound. Zion looked down at his worn-out shoes, their heels long faded, now dragged through an unnameable series of procedures. Beneath him, the gray stone floor gleamed under the lights like the surface of a dead stream. The iron bench had no armrests, and the curved back forced him to sit upright, as if being interrogated, though no one had asked a question yet. The chill from the stone wall seeped through his clothes, quietly sinking into his spine. Duke approached, phone camera already recording, his face twisted with a mix of amusement and irritation. Without asking Gavin, he bent the phone to frame Zion squarely in the shot. "This'll blow up on the socials," he said, chuckling and mumbling as if composing a caption in his head. "Alien creature in the courtroom." His finger skimmed the screen, adjusting focus, then gave a thumbs up to Gavin, as if praising a job well done. Zion didn't look at him. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then reopened them, fixing his gaze straight ahead as if the opposite wall was the only thing steady in the warped air around him. His back pressed to the bench, hands still bound behind him, and his head resting on a fragile hope that once you hit rock bottom, people at least stop. But this hallway had no bottom. It was a slippery slope polished by silent consensus, where every procedure was fake but felt real, and every cruel remark was understood as just a joke. The side doorbell rang from the end of the hall as an administrative worker pushed a cart of documents past, her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the hallway's light was the only thing that existed. Zion caught that gaze, but she didn't stop. She kept walking, head bowed slightly, steps steady and quick, as if fearing that if she slowed for even a moment, she too would be forced into that chair. That silence was scarier than any curse. It was acceptance sealed by inaction. Gavin leaned against the wall, arms crossed as if having completed an important task. He said nothing further, but his eyes spoke volumes. Duke pocketed his phone, clicked his tongue, and left, leaving behind a heavy void and a performance played out without an official audience. Zion didn't move. The air conditioner's cold breeze hit his forehead in chilling waves, but it wasn't enough to ease the dull ache beneath his collarbone. He didn't think about the video clip or the fact that he would be treated as entertainment by people who needed no reason to oppress. He just stared straight ahead, determined not to let his gaze waver, because once it falls, everything around him would be allowed to become real, and he wasn't going to let that happen. Down the hall, a security guard in a dark blue uniform rounded the corner and caught sight of Zion being forced to sit, hands cuffed, head bowed like an exhibit. He paused mid-step, eyes flicking from Gavin to Duke, finally resting on the cold metal bench, and the black child placed in the lowest possible position. For a moment, something sparked in the guard's eyes, unease, or perhaps a tightening conscience, but then he blinked and turned away. His right hand reached into his jacket, pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, lit one, tapping it lightly against his badge as if to wake himself. He walked on without looking back, his steps following a route rehearsed over hundreds of shifts where scenes like this had become part of the building's familiar background noise. Zion heard the footsteps fade and knew another had chosen silence. He held no anger. Responsibility was a luxury in a space where badges and uniforms could swap places with fear at any moment. He breathed steadily, kept his back straight, and glanced right toward Duke, who was still fiddling with his phone. Zion's eyes locked directly on the camera lens, which had just lowered to his face's level. Duke caught that gaze, raising an eyebrow as if expecting a weak reaction, plea, or at least some panic. But Zion did not lower his head. His face twitched not, his lips did not purse, eyes did not flinch. He looked straight into the camera, his gaze neither raised nor lowered but strong enough to cut through the distance between them. His voice came clear, each word and pause carrying a calm that stung. "Post this. My mother will see how you work." Duke faltered. Not because Zion spoke loudly or threatened, but because of the way he spoke. Duke wasn't sure if he faced a teenager or someone he ought to fear. He looked back at the screen, the frame fixed on that face, a face never trembling despite being shoved, pulled, mocked. A calmness stole the satisfaction from Duke's gut. He pocketed his phone with a sigh but said nothing. Gavin, who had been leaning on a file folder writing something, turned upon hearing those words. He looked down at Zion, colder than ever, but without a sarcastic remark or mocking smile this time. Only restraint, as if he hadn't fully grasped what had just been said, or he understood but didn't know how to respond. Zion sat without leaning back, chin slightly raised, the overhead light casting a diagonal shadow that revealed the faint bruise along his cheekbone. In that brief moment, the order Gavin knew seemed to crack slightly. Zion was unbroken, unweakened, and dared to invoke his mother as a weapon Gavin could not see. That disturbed him more than any physical resistance. For men like him, silence with hidden meaning was always more dangerous than a slap. And that gaze, that voice, struck exactly where Gavin had believed no one could reach. Zion stayed seated, eyes steady, breath even, words unwithdrawn. He did not care if Duke posted or Gavin wrote in the file. He knew the words he spoke were the only thing not distorted. Everything else could be edited, retold however they wished. But the moment he looked into the eyes of the man filming and said his mother would want to see everything, that moment would endure without proof, because the one who needed to see would know when it was time to step in, and when she did, no one would have time to rewind. The sound of heels striking the stone floor rang out sharply, not loud but enough to silence every other noise in the hallway as if cut off by a thin blade. It echoed once, then again, each beat testing the reflexes of those standing there. Gavin tilted his head, not fully turning but moving his eyes enough to locate the source of the sound. Duke Glancy, the smirk on his lips fading abruptly as the air thickened around them. A woman appeared at the end of the hall, striding with legs straight and firm, as if the tiled floor had to brace itself to support each step. Regan Cross needed no introduction. The way she approached, her eyes scanning Gavin, Duke, and Zion like a coded message demanding careful reading, made it clear she had not arrived by chance. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face serious as always. Her dark blue vest bore no logos or insignias, but the fabric, the stitching, and how she wore it said one thing: she was not someone to be stopped. She knew no one in this setting, nor did she appear unfamiliar. She simply arrived exactly when others still thought it was too soon. Zion lifted his head. For a brief second, his eyes widened, not from surprise, but from silent acknowledgement. He had been waiting for that sound of footsteps the moment he was cuffed, not because he believed in rescue, but because he knew who would never stay silent when truth was dragged into the shadows. Regan said nothing as she neared, her gaze fixed on the locked wrist, pausing at the red mark on the boy's skin. She stood tall, looked from the wrist to Gavin's relaxed hand at his side, then met his eyes. Her voice rang out steady and sharp. "Remove the cuffs." Gavin chuckled softly, as if dealing with a citizen more difficult than allowed. "Who are you?" "This is the detainee processing area, not a place for family to issue orders." He turned to Duke, nodded slightly, and began reaching for his badge at his belt. Regan didn't flinch. She raised her right hand, pulling from her jacket pocket a slim object with no hard casing, just a shiny laminated card bearing a single black inscription in the center: Central Intelligence Authorization. Below it was a string of internal codes known only to a few, but for those who recognized them, no further explanation was needed. Duke swallowed hard. His hand stayed in his pocket, but his thumb twitched as if to pull out a phone, then stopped. Gavin squinted, shifting his gaze from the card to Regan's eyes, then asked slowly, "What authority do you have here?" Regan did not withdraw her hand, nor lower the card. "You don't need to know why I'm here, and I am once again ordering you to remove those handcuffs." Zion remained seated, his eyes fixed on both his mother's face and Gavin's. Between them lay a space of about 3 steps, but the air there was denser than anywhere else in the hallway. Neither spoke, but Regan Cross's mere presence shook the fragile order of that morning to its deepest core. For the first time, Gavin was unsure if he still controlled anyone among the 3 people in that room. Regan did not take another step. She stopped at just the right distance from Duke to make him look up. Her gaze dropped to the phone still warm in his hand, for less than a second, then looked him straight in the eye. "Did you record enough? Send it to me if you don't want to lose your job by morning." Duke did not move. His neck twitched. His eyes shifted from the screen to the badge in her hand that still had not lowered. His confidence withdrew like the tide, leaving a thick layer of awkwardness around the corners of his mouth. Regan did not wait for a response. She turned towards Zion, her gaze checking not out of pity but to assess his state. His wrists were still locked, his eyes still clear, and his back not resting against the chair. She nodded lightly, confirming he was still in control. No comforting words were spoken because those who have lived through real violence know that compassion is not found in what is said. It is in what does not need to be said. Gavin only now turned fully around. His hand still rested on Zion's shoulder, a final claim to his authority. He looked at the woman before him with the eyes of someone accustomed to privilege, and saw a force he could not categorize. "Who are you to think you can give orders here?" His voice was low, direct, and carried that layer of mockery so familiar among those in uniform when they feel their ground shift. She looked at Gavin's hand gripping her son's shoulder, her gaze lingering just long enough that words became unnecessary. Then she raised her head, eyes meeting precisely between his eyebrows, her tone steady as before. "Take your hand off his shoulder. Your question isn't wrong, but you're asking the wrong person." Duke still stood nearby, hands at his sides, but his gaze had not left his phone. The hallway seemed to shrink with the silence created by a distance no one dared cross. Gavin slowly let go, not out of persuasion, but because he knew any unnecessary move now would become footage for a video he could not control. As his hand left Zion's shoulder, the air in the hallway seemed to shift. No one moved, but order had shifted to a place Gavin no longer occupied. Regan stepped forward, standing right in front of her handcuffed son. She did not ask if he was all right, did not ask why he had been held. She simply asked, "Does it hurt?" Zion looked straight into his mother's eyes and nodded. No complaint, no hiding, just a truth that needed to be acknowledged. She turned to Duke, who was still standing by, an extra in the scene. "Are you planning to send the video?" Duke shook his head, his lips moving but no words coming out. Reagan took her phone from her coat pocket, typed a few lines, then held it up. "No need. I already pulled a backup copy from the system. What you send is just to see how far he'll go with his performance." Gavin stepped half a pace back, his shoulders tense. His eyes stayed fixed, but his lips trembled slightly as if forcing himself not to say anything he would regret. He did not ask her name again, because now he understood the answer was beyond rank or title. Reagan never needed to say her name to those who had grown too used to wielding power the wrong way. She only needed to show up at the right moment. And this time, that timing alone was enough to break the habits of a system that once thought itself untouchable. Reagan never took her eyes off Gavin. Her gaze was understated, yet enough to make him adjust his breathing. She stood tall, one hand resting on her hip as if needing no permission to say what was coming next. Just as Gavin began to speak again, she cut him off with a calm, unaccented voice, each word hitting the floor like metal. "My name is Cross. I'm not here to persuade. I'm here to end the jokes you all think are simple." Odd. At that moment, Duke glanced at Gavin, seemingly expecting a strong reaction to regain control, but Gavin didn't step forward or argue. He remained still, fingers lightly gripping the edge of his belt, eyes fixed on Reagan with an unmistakable caution. What had just happened was not part of the script he was used to. Usually, the arrested would scream, family members would rush to intervene, and police had every reason to hold them for disorderly conduct. Reagan stepped closer, her eyes scanning Duke once more before resting on Zion's wrists, still cuffed behind his back. Her left hand pulled a set of keys from her coat pocket, an item possessed only by those deep inside the system. The keys bore no tags or numbers, only matte black steel heads meticulously ground like a tool meant for covert operations. She moved behind her son, slipped her hand down, inserted a key into the metal lock, and turned it gently. The click of the lock echoed clearly. The handcuffs opened without resistance. Zion lowered his hands slowly, rubbing his wrists where the marks had yet to fade, then straightened up, eyes fixed forward without turning to thank her. Words were unnecessary between them. Their trust preceded any verbal confirmation. Gavin stepped back further. He seemed about to say something, but was stopped by Reagan's gaze. She didn't look at him like a victor, nor did she attempt to belittle him with words. Yet the way she stood, solid like a rock, blocking the divide between conscience and corruption, rendered every excuse forming in Gavin's mind hollow. He knew all too well that if he spoke again, his words would become evidence against himself in an investigation she would surely oversee with no detail overlooked. Reagan turned back and spoke to Zion in a quieter tone. "Stand up. No one has the right to keep you here without charges." Zion rose, his shoulders still sore, but his movements decisive. The first steps after being uncuffed always differ. They aren't the steps of someone pardoned, but of someone who has just affirmed they were never wrong. At the far end of the hallway, an administrative officer entered carrying a stack of files. He froze when he saw Reagan standing there, Zion beside her, and Gavin silently watching. No explanation was needed. The scene was clear. The balance of power had shifted, not by protests or shouting, but by a woman who knew exactly when to stand up and when to step forward to end what should never have begun. Gavin stepped back just enough to regain his posture, but a smirk played on his lips, the kind of smile worn by someone convinced he understood the rules, that what remained was mere procedure. He adjusted his jacket, eyes fixed on Reagan, then said with barely concealed sarcasm, "CIA has no authority in this state courthouse." Duke stood nearby, twitching the corner of his mouth but saying nothing, as if waiting for a nod from his superior to resume the interrupted intimidation. His gaze flicked from Gavin back to Reagan, betraying uncertainty. Men like Duke sensed when the tide was turning, but lacked the courage to choose sides without orders. Reagan remained still, neither frowning nor reacting to Gavin's confident claim. Only her eyes sharpened, unyielding like a bulletproof shield slowly descending. She replied, enunciating each word clearly, "But I have the right to reclaim my son when you're committing a federal crime right in front of me." The hallway fell silent. The thick air seemed to congeal. Gavin froze, his smirk vanishing at the word federal. He knew Reagan's statement was no ordinary threat. It was a blade cutting through a boundary even officers accustomed to force dared not cross. Reagan waited for no reply. She stepped halfway forward to stand level with Zion, eyes still on Gavin as if granting him time to consider his next move. Zion said nothing. He stood straight beside his mother, hands now free at his sides, eyes steady but patient. An employee carrying documents emerged from the records room, stopping mid-hall at the scene before her. She looked from Zion to Reagan to Gavin. Silence prevailed. Reagan nodded lightly at her, a silent assurance that control remained. Gavin inhaled, seemingly disoriented for the first time that morning. He neither stepped back nor forward. His hands left his belt, neither reaching for cuffs, gun, nor radio. He just stood there, caught between old power long wielded and new limits pointed out to him for the first time. Reagan turned to her son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go," she said firmly, but quietly. Zion nodded and followed her without looking back. Each step was steady as a clock ticking to the right moment, not rushed, but never slow. Behind them, Gavin stood frozen. Duke avoided his gaze and turned away, as if withdrawing from the image he had just made clear. The file-carrying officer leaned against the wall, fingers tightening on the folder's edge to keep the papers from falling, eyes following the two who walked away without orders, without permission, without explanation. Silence stretched along the courthouse hall on what seemed like a normal morning. But after that encounter, none of them believed that morning was ordinary, especially Gavin, who realized something he never thought he'd hear in his life. Someone knew he was breaking the law, and that person did not need permission to stop him. Zion stood straight in the hallway, his recently freed hand curling slightly, the red marks on his wrist still oozing blood at the edge of the cuff that hadn't fully closed. He took a deep breath, then looked toward his mother. The cold air from the overhead air conditioner swept down, numbing the skin around his wrist, but not slowing him even half a step. While Gavin's eyes lingered behind, still probing as if nothing had truly ended, Zion tilted his head slightly, lips pressed into a thin line, not mocking but silent, with the knowing of someone who understood this game from the start. "My mother isn't here to testify," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "She's here to stop what you're doing." That statement wasn't meant for her, but for those who still thought this was just a dispute between civilians and police. She held her gaze steady exactly where it needed to be, on Gavin's chest, where his badge would usually sit, but which she believed now pulsed on instinct rather than principle. She spoke, neither loud nor soft, as if reminding them of an unspoken rule. One mother alone doesn't need approval. Duke turned his head away. He didn't want to see Gavin's reaction, didn't want to hear another word. He stepped away, hands nervously twisting his pockets, lips sealed as if all sound had become dangerous. It was a retreat at an unnamed but universally recognized place. Zion stood between two extremes. One, his mother's shadow shielding him with strange calm. The other, the man who had once gripped his shoulder like a beast in captivity. But now, Gavin had let go. He neither admitted fault nor apologized, but the prolonged silence spoke louder than any struggle ever could. The order he believed in had been cut short, not by logic, but by something he could never master, a certainty that needed no proof. Reagan turned her back, stepping toward the exit. Her footsteps were no longer heavy like when she arrived. Now, each step sent a clear message into the corridor's silent structure. Zion followed, neither hesitating nor rushing. His back stayed straight, his shoulders did not slump, though they still burned. A single drop of blood fell to the stone floor as he walked, spreading into a lone red spot amidst the whiteness of a day planned to erase all lines between truth and lies. The door at the end of the hall opened before anyone could call them back. A court staffer froze upon seeing them pass, eyes darting behind as if waiting for confirmation to intervene. But no one signaled, no one spoke. Gavin remained rooted in place, hands loosely clasped behind his back, eyes tracking them without the earlier sharpness. Though he did not admit it, he knew everything had just crossed the limits he could control. Reagan stopped at the threshold, her gaze drifting to the left, where Duke still lingered near a stone column. Her voice cut through, steady as when she began, but now laced with an icy edge crawling under skin. Police are not permitted to detain the unconvicted inside a court unless they are the ones doing it. Her words weren't loud but spread like wildfire. each syllable striking like a sharp blade on the marble tabletop. Duke swallowed dryly, one leg twitching slightly, hand going into his pocket, then pulling out again, before hiding it once more. No one came to his defense. No rebuttal followed. The entire hallway fell silent, as if those standing there wondered what they had just heard, or whether they were now being exposed by the very backs turned to them. Gavin was different. His face twitched uncontrollably, as if the mask he had worn for years had started to crack under a heat no one else could see. He took a step forward, hand swinging lightly, his eyes snapping toward Reagan. "Who do you think you are to?" But before he could finish, a figure in a dress shirt appeared at the door to the administrative office, stepping between him and the woman who had just shifted the entire atmosphere. The young court employee, face not yet marked by years on the job but with a steady gaze, said, "She's already called federal investigators. The team is upstairs." Gavin froze mid-stride. The words were not loud, but they landed like lead pouring from the ceiling onto his shoulders. The way he turned, very slowly, was no longer a reflex, but the motion of someone reassessing his entire place in a hierarchy that once made others look away, and that made him choke. Reagan moved past the staffer. For her, everything that had just happened was not a victory, but the start of a process long overdue. She did not look back at Gavin and gave him no further reaction. Zion followed close behind, still silent, his face showing neither anger nor relief, just a clarity that had never faded since the beginning. He was not wrong. Down the hall, the sound of other footsteps began to rise. They moved quickly, quietly, but steadily, like a drumbeat, laying the ground for a shift in tone. Gavin heard every step, his face unmoved, but his eyes clouded. He knew that once those people reached him, nothing he had done that morning could be shielded by the word authority. He still had time to deny, to delay, but there was no room left to retreat. Duke jerked back, pressing into the space beside a column. The court employee took his phone from his breast pocket, quickly typed a few lines, and spoke something softly into his radio. That movement did not cause chaos, but it brought the feeling of a room that had just changed owners without a single signature. Reagan and Zion faded into the distance past the last row of doors, the light from the windows crossing their shadows along the stone floor. Each turned in a different direction, one toward the internal review hall, the other back to the intake area. Yet every motion traced back to the center, the place where mother and son had passed, and in the unspoken sigh of Gavin was something he should not define. Perhaps for the first time he felt consequences coming toward him on real feet. No regret, no fear, but present, and drawing closer. The next day, the courtroom's atmosphere had completely changed. Those who had remained silent the day before now sat upright in the audience, their expressions unreadable, neither supportive nor opposed, but all eyes were fixed on the main witness table. Gavin arrived early, no longer wearing his usual dark jacket, instead donning a slightly wrinkled shirt at the shoulders and collar. He entered with his lawyer, trying to maintain a stern expression, but anyone who knew him well enough could see the lingering defensiveness in his eyes. As the panel began revisiting the events of the previous day, the initial questions were gentle, focusing on verifying procedures and each person's position in the sequence of events. Gavin answered steadily but couldn't hide his irritation whenever Reagan or Zion was mentioned. When a committee member directly asked, "Do you consider the act of tightening the cuffs, forcing down the chair, and dragging in the hallway necessary behavior?" Gavin leaned toward the microphone, sighed deeply, then stepped back from the podium as if wanting to distance himself from his own words. "She's fabricating stories from someone uneducated," he said, glancing toward the back of the room where Zion sat between two advisors. His tone remained even, but cracks appeared in his voice. That statement was unprepared, off-script from any defense plan, and everyone present recognized it immediately. Reagan's expression didn't change. She slowly rose from her seat, walked to the center table where the projection controls sat, and pulled a phone from her coat pocket. "I'm not fabricating anything," she said as she connected the device. "I'm just replaying what the court's camera recorded." The large screen lit up. Footage from a high-angle hallway camera appeared. The shot was narrow but clear enough to see every movement. Zion sat still on the metal chair while Gavin approached, grabbing Zion's shoulder forcefully, spinning him, and pressing him down into the seat. The scene played without edits or voiceover. Next came Gavin tightening Zion's wrist cuffs, twisting the lock, then pushing him away. The boy's face tilted to one side from the force, his neck misaligned. The room fell silent. No one looked at Reagan. All eyes were glued to the screen. Reagan turned to the panel and said simply, "I don't use words. I use data." No one asked her to say more. For a few seconds, the only sounds were the tapping of a stenographer's pen and the shuffling of papers from the prosecution's lawyer. Zion's gaze never left the screen. He neither bowed his head nor raised it as if proving something. He simply kept his steady look, as if watching himself from outside his body, checking for any moment he might have been wrong. Gavin turned away from the screen, lips pressed tight. He knew some parts of the file could be argued, but not the images. He offered no rebuttal. The lawyer beside him remained seated, perhaps instructed beforehand. "If the footage appears, stay silent." After nearly a minute of silence, a council member spoke up. "The footage has been verified as unedited." The technical team confirmed frame continuity. No one nodded or applauded, but the weight of the recording made all reasoning moot. No one questioned why Reagan was there that day. They only calculated how many procedures it would take to start escalating the case to the federal level. For the first time, Gavin found no words to speak. Because the images required no defense, they just needed to be seen. And that morning, everyone saw clearly. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier after the video ended. Though no one spoke, every glance and breath became cautious. Gavin sat down, hands clasped before him, like a man trying to steady himself amid a fall already begun. His eyes flicked toward the lawyer, then out the door, as if seeking an escape that didn't exist. A young prosecutor, appointed within the year, slowly rose. He wore a pale shirt, a tightly knotted tie, and a fresh name tag. His voice wasn't loud, but carried every word distinctly like a delayed confession. "I've never seen a police officer handle a suspect like this in court." His remark wasn't aimed at anyone, yet it affected all. The bluntness of one unsoftened by the system cracked a small hole in the long-standing wall built from habit and excuse. Reagan did not hesitate. She turned to him, eyes steady but resolute, like the look she gave Gavin that morning. "Then today you've seen," she said, each word spoken as an irreversible choice. "Write it down. From now on, you stand with the witnesses or with the accomplices." No one in the room smiled or nodded in agreement. Each was listening to themselves. Those words were meant not just for the young prosecutor, but for everyone who has seen yet chose silence. The clerk beside the counsel desk typed a few lines, hands trembling slightly. She didn't look up but pressed her lips to hold back any expression that might betray what she'd just heard. From the back row, a middle-aged woman flipped a notebook open, marking a line as if to record the words for the end-of-day session. Zion sat quietly beside his mother, his gaze no longer on Gavin or the prosecutor, but silently following each face around him. Something had shifted among these strangers. Gone was curiosity. Gone was the anticipation of someone's mistake to prove oneself right. Instead came a pause, as if a curtain had been pulled back to reveal a stage they once thought only existed in the news. An older council member, gray beard close to his chin, hands intertwined before him, spoke after a pause. "We need to confirm all individuals present at the time of the incident." His voice was low and measured, but this time no longer probing. Everyone understood the matter had moved beyond the bounds of a hearing. It had exceeded the limits of a mere report. Gavin looked up, eyes hardening but silent. He knew every word could become the prelude to an indictment if misstepped. Those accustomed to raw power often falter when pulled into realms of reason. And now, reason had enough facts to begin its work. Reagan said nothing more. She sat down, hands resting on the table, eyes fixed nowhere in particular. Her presence no longer threatened, but became the standard by which everyone's response was weighed. Those still evasive would need to pick a side. Those ambiguous must declare their stance, and those silent yesterday would no longer be allowed to be silent today. Her words echoed in their minds, either witness or accomplice. No third option. Under the harsh white light of the judicial records room, an old file was opened, its spine worn, pages yellowed, marked with a red pencil on the edge. The archive manager nodded when Reagan indicated the file to review. Without many words, she flipped to the first page as if already knowing what lay within. Internal report, number 116. A. Concerning the death of a black youth, Jamal Cruz, 17 years old, who died while being pursued by Officer Gavin Holt. O. Reagan did not need to read further. She pulled from her bag another cross-referenced copy, reprinted from the secure database of the Federal Independent Inspector's Office. Black ink underlines highlighted clear contradictions, Gavin's testimony, report timing, and video segments cut from the original record. Jamal was unarmed, had no criminal record, and had shouted, "I'm scared," seconds before collapsing near a lamppost outside camera range. The next morning's meeting room felt oddly cramped whenever Jamal's name was mentioned. Some on the council remembered the case but either did not know or chose not to acknowledge that it directly involved Gavin. At the time, he was a young officer, rated as decisive, quick to respond, and loyal to protocol. No one brought up that he had failed to activate his body camera. No one wanted to question a colleague amid a public storm. Reagan lifted her head and said sharply, "The victim was a black teenager. Police chased him despite no recorded illegal behavior, and the officer present was Gavin." She tapped the table lightly, rhythmically, each tap carving deeper into the mounting silence. Nearby, a member of the Federal Investigation Team opened a second file. The cover read, "Case, Duke Morgan, Patrol Unit 17B." Inside, the first line stood out, "Complaint filed for abuse of power and racially offensive language during the detention of a minor at Central Heights Park." The complainant was a nurse, an independent witness unrelated to the victim. The complaint was filed 5 years prior but was closed after 8 weeks with the familiar conclusion, "Insufficient evidence to proceed with investigation." Reagan turned to the next page, showing the nurse's statement. The officer called the boy a lesson needed and intimidated him with a baton when he refused to lie face down. The nurse had photographed the injuries, but because the evidence was sent via personal email and not stored in the system, the court deemed it inadmissible. The data was unrecognized, but it remained and now lay on the table before everyone. Duke was still sitting there, his eyes wide with panic, but his shoulders leaning back, as if bracing himself to push back. But he said nothing. No one needed him to speak. Everything was already too clear. 4 years had passed, and now, every case file once forced closed was popping open under a gaze that no longer flinched. Reagan slid 2 folders toward the investigator. "I don't call this evidence. I call this a beginning. You may call it something else, but only if you are willing to sign your name to it." She did not need to shout, did not need to frighten anyone. What made the room heavy was the fact that no one had a reason left to look away. Brown veneered walls, dark blue curtains, a desk covered in glass. Everything sat silent, like the very power that once protected overlooked records. But today, in that very room, every crossed-out page was forcing those around it to rewrite, not with ink, but with their place in the story. In a private office at regional federal headquarters, no nameplate on the door and always slightly ajar, Reagan had once marked Gavin Holt's name on an internal list. That list was never meant to be shared, the result of years of tracking odd files, officers with high complaint rates, late reports, suspiciously blurry cameras, and internal findings that always said, "insufficient evidence." Holt was among the first 30 names, always near the top, not for the toast cases, but for the cold precision of every detail erased. But Reagan had never touched him. No reason was solid enough, no case piled high enough to become an official complaint, until Zion was dragged from his chair in court, and she had no reason left to wait. In a corner of the investigation room, sunlight spilling across the tile floor, Zion sat facing his mother. The bloodstain had dried and darkened, and instead of looking down, he lifted his head straight. Reagan stayed silent. From start to finish, she had never once asked him to explain. But Zion was ready, not giving her the chance to keep quiet. "You didn't need to bring the whole federal team to rescue me," he said, his voice rough but steady, as if he had rehearsed those lines 1,000 times in his mind. "I don't need you to prove I'm innocent. I need them to see I'm real. Name, face, voice, none of that is anonymous." He paused, meeting her gaze. "They thought I was just like the others, blurred in reports. A single line, a period at the end." Reagan placed her hand on the table, her palm trembling slightly, but her voice unshaken. "Do you know why I never talked about work at home? Not because I didn't trust you to understand, but because I knew, if one day you saw what I've seen, you'd never be allowed to be ordinary again." Zion smiled gently, neither mocking nor defiant. He only said, "Today I'm not ordinary, but don't call it a surprise." That moment was not a conversation between a wounded child and a protective mother. It was the crossing of two paths that had run parallel. One child raised in the long shadow of justice, and a mother who always wore a gun at her side but never showed her badge to her son. And now, both stood in the overlap between distorted justice and the faith that needed to be set right. Regan did not reply immediately. She pulled out a thin printed page, the headline in capitals, Internal State Police Investigation Intervention Oversight Report. Under line 12, the name Gavin Holt appeared again, and this time, no one could claim she was fabricating it. Zion looked at that name and said nothing more. "I don't need to win," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I need them to remember." Regan nodded. "And for them to remember, they have to see first." The brick walls where they sat were still the old bricks of the 1980s courthouse, never renovated, but the space inside was no longer a place for files to be pressed down. It was the beginning of something everyone understood. This time, what they knew would not disappear again. At 9 a.m., a resignation letter was submitted to the court management office with a brief reason. Mental health instability, requires time for recovery. The signer was Darla Quinn, an administrative assistant responsible for coordinating trial files on the third floor. She made no prior call, waited for no approval, simply left her file folder and desk keys, then exited through the rear parking lot door. 30 minutes later, an unnamed video appeared on a private forum for anti-abuse activists. The camera angle was fixed, the timestamp blurred, but the image was unmistakable. Gavin Holt, dragging Zion Mercer out of the courtroom with one hand, the other gripping the gun at his hip, walking straight past the empty waiting benches with heavy steps, no words, no unnecessary movements. The rows of chairs on either side were empty, as if even the air had been swept away by the threat of silence. No sound came from the video, yet viewers felt a crushing weight, as if standing between two sealed concrete walls. The hallway light cast down on Gavin's face, revealing eyes unrestrained, not the look of an officer maintaining order, but of a man shedding the last remnants of moral restraint. Behind him, Zion's steps faltered, his head slightly bowed, one arm stretched as he was pulled to one side, his collar pulled back exposing a red, raw patch of skin from the tight grip. No screams, no pleas. Just the way he was led like a forgotten object sparked an uncontrollable flood of comments beneath the video. The first comment read, "He drags him like trash." The second, "Is this a court or a secret detention center?" Immediately followed by calls demanding that the full footage be released. A federal investigation was opened, and Gavin Holt's urgent dismissal. Regan received the leak notification while standing in a federal building elevator. She showed no surprise or sigh, merely glanced at the screen and pocketed her phone. The video was not distributed by her, but she knew for sure the sender was not seeking publicity. It was a deliberate trigger from those who had stayed silent too long, witnessed too much, and understood that one timely click could make an entire power chain halt. At the courthouse security office, a young staffer checking cameras was halted by a scheduled maintenance request. He glanced at his coworker. No one spoke, but their looks needed no translation. The original video had been deleted, but copies were no longer held by a single person. They had been downloaded, stored, and replicated on multiple devices, ready to be released in layers, just as truth, once exposed, cannot be pushed back into a sealed box. As for Darla, the woman who resigned that morning, she never returned. But in the envelope she left, beneath her resignation letter, was a handwritten line in black ink. "That video is real. I have a copy in the cloud. If anyone finds me, I will unlock it for the prosecuting attorney directly. I stay silent not to keep my job, but to preserve evidence." An anonymous woman in a system that seemed invisible, yet sometimes they are the last gatekeepers before truth disappears without a trace. Within less than 6 hours of the hallway footage being released, over 1 million views poured in, accompanied by thousands of comments, shares, and calls for protests outside the local police headquarters. But it wasn't the numbers that shocked, it was the tone. The comments didn't come from large organizations or media outlets, but from mothers, fathers, those once dragged into darkness, or those who witnessed their loved ones pulled from the light of the law. One message stood out among the sea of words. "If that were my child, I'd be dead in jail, and I'd do it again if I had the choice." Another wrote, "I see the shoes of that boy, just like my 8th-grade son. That scene will haunt me for months. Amid this wave, Reagan sat alone in an office with frosted glass, her navy blazer buttoned to the collar. On the desk lay a printed letter, the agency's seal stamped in the lower right corner. She sent no emails, made no calls, and authorized no proxy. She wrote the letter by hand, signed it fully, and personally delivered it to the police chief's office. The guard hesitated but asked no questions. Reagan nodded softly. Deliver it to the intended recipient. Do not allow anyone else to open it first. The letter contained no threats or convoluted legal jargon. Only one closing line forced an emergency meeting of the department's legal office. I am not suing for honor. I am suing so they never dare do this to another child. No one in the room dared ask who they were. Everyone understood. It represented a system accustomed to immunity, skilled at twisting reports, treating victims as mere footnotes in statements. But this time, they were not facing a lone child or a desperate mother. They confronted someone who knew exactly how the system erased traces and exactly which trail to follow to bring everything into the light. Reagan waited for no response. She returned, opened her phone, and began saving every comment and viral clip circulating online. Each line was a fragment of long simmering outrage. One user wrote, "I was dragged down that very hallway. I was 17. No cameras, no Reagan Cross, and no one remembers my name." An internal communications officer prepared a calming article, but before posting, he received an anonymous message. Don't dilute other people's blood with neutral words. The piece was removed from the draft system less than 30 minutes later. Meanwhile, the state prosecutor's office officially reopened 2 investigations linked to Gavin Holt and Duke Morgan, including the teenager's death last year. The media dubbed it the Cross Effect, but Reagan remained silent, refused interviews, and quietly directed her legal team to review all on-site arrest procedures within the courthouse, from the victim's initial escort to the official detention record. In the hallway where the video was recorded, an unsigned handwritten note appeared on the wall. It read simply, "Silence is not innocence. Seeing and not responding is complicity." The note was removed by day's end, but in the hearts of those who witnessed, who once trembled and lowered their heads before uniforms, it was not torn down, it was etched deep. And this time, Zion was no longer the name of a stranger's child. He became a milestone, a system placed under the scalpel, with no doctor able to heal unless willing to face the long-festered wound. 1 week after the video circulated, the Special Investigation Committee officially opened a public hearing in the Grand Hall of the state courthouse. There were no closed doors, no edited transcripts, no statements through representatives. All testimonies were recorded live and broadcast on regional television, as well as online for the public. In the rows below, reporters jostled for space. In the front row, Reagan Cross sat upright, eyes fixed steadily on the podium without blinking. The hearing chair gave a brief introduction, then called Gavin Holt to the stand. He appeared in his full military uniform, adorned with all badges, his tie neatly adjusted, and walked with the confidence of someone freshly honored. The crowd did not applaud, but cameras followed every step, as if his cold demeanor was rehearsed. When asked to respond to the charges, Gavin showed no hesitation. He stepped close to the microphone, cleared his throat softly, then spoke without lowering his gaze. "I completely deny all allegations. What I did that day was standard procedure when dealing with a subject with a criminal record and a history of resisting law enforcement." He did not say suspect, nor did he mention Zion. He only referred to the teenager as the subject. The courtroom was so silent that the tapping of a pen from a journalist in the back caused heads to turn. But not everyone was surprised. Some committee members were familiar with such confidence, tempered by uniformed authority and rules dictated by control units. One person noted the response in red ink. "Resistance on what basis?" A female committee member asked. "Are you aware that the subject was removed from the courtroom without a detention order?" Gavin shrugged. "I have the authority to take precautionary measures if I perceive a potential for disturbance. All my actions were within regulatory limits." And why was the subject handcuffed? "For non-cooperation and provocative speech, based on the clause preventing incitement in court." A soft scoff came from the right row, which was Reagan. No one told her to be quiet, as everyone else was holding their breath. A reporter scribbled in their notebook, "Confidence beyond conscience." Gavin continued. This time attempting a slightly softer tone. We cannot allow emotion to replace the law. I was tasked with maintaining security for the hearing. I did just that. Another member interrupted. You know, Zion Mercer had no criminal record, and that the hearing was unrelated to any charges against him. Can you explain where the subject with a criminal record claim came from? Gavin was silent for exactly 3 seconds, visibly unsettled for the first time. I received a warning from the internal system, but there may have been an update error. Oh, Reagan tilted her head slightly, whispering to the lawyer beside her. She did not attempt to hide her attitude, nor did she smile as she usually would. Someone nearby quickly scribbled down her words. The system's updates may be wrong, but his hands were precise when he twisted the boy's wrist. Gavin's words had barely finished when the room fell silent, as if someone had just pulled the plug from the wall. But the quiet did not last long. Reagan Cross rose from the second row without waiting to be called. Without announcement, she walked to the podium, held out her badge to the commission members, and spoke, each word as sharp as a blade slicing through the crumbling layers of power on display. "My boy has no record," she said, her eyes never leaving Gavin, "and I dare anyone to produce a single document saying otherwise. But if today you are set on confirming that skin color is a crime, then I suggest we stop trying one person. Let's put all of America on trial." A gasp broke from the back. A middle-aged man blurted out, then covered his mouth, not from embarrassment, but because it had been so many years since he had heard such words spoken aloud, right in the place considered the sanctuary of law. The secretarial team stood frozen. One of them slowly typed out every word, then stopped entirely, just to see if anyone dared object. The presiding judge tried to interrupt, but it was too late. Zion, from the witness seat, had already lifted his head. His eyes, once lowered from hundreds of prejudiced stares, now stood upright with his mother's resolve, unwavering, unyielding. He spoke slowly but with certainty, not with angry force, but with a calm forged over a decade. "If you need me to bow my head to feel your power, I will keep it raised." A 16-year-old black boy, in a room never meant to hear voices like his, had just landed a decisive blow without raising a hand, and what left Gavin unable to respond was not a lack of words, but a lack of justification. One of the oldest commission members turned to the secretary and, almost as a sigh, said, "Record that verbatim. We are not just investigating an incident, we are witnessing a living indictment." Gavin shifted in his seat. His tall frame was no longer strong, but became an awkward shadow, blocking his way out. He looked to Reagan, but not with contempt this time, rather, with uncertainty. She did not back down, did not interrupt, did not smirk. She stood firm, letting time do its work. A young female reporter live-streamed the hearing, her hand shaking but her voice steady. "We are witnessing a confrontation between a system used to hiding its faults and a mother who refuses to be silent, and a 16-year-old boy has turned himself into a testimony that no one can erase." Gavin bowed his head, not out of guilt, but because he had nothing left to hold on to. The transcript kept rolling. The commission members murmured among themselves, none leaving their seats. In the rows behind, it seemed no one moved, except for a black woman hugging her daughter and softly saying, "See that, honey? Sometimes raising your head is enough." The hearing was not yet over, but from the moment Gavin misspoke, the balance in the room had shifted, not toward Reagan's side, but toward those once labeled troublemakers, simply for looking straight ahead instead of down. And this time, that look was returning, through cameras, through transcripts, through questions that were no longer so easy to swallow. Gavin's lawyer was a white man in his 50s, with neatly parted hair and a dark suit that made him look more like a bank representative than an attorney defending an officer accused of abuse. He opened his statement with familiar phrases like on-scene assessment, professional response, and subjective risk level in specific circumstances. He emphasized that his client acted within legal boundaries, claiming the presence of a youth with a history of defiance and hostile attitude forced Lieutenant Gavin Holt to apply necessary restraining measures. Reagan did not interrupt. She sat cross-legged, hands clasped before her as if she had heard hundreds of similar defenses. But when the lawyer concluded by asserting that all actions were within the framework of public safety protection, Reagan stood up and placed a thin document before the committee, stamped bright red like a dagger piercing the padded room. "May I add," she said, her voice neither loud nor soft, "a document never before disclosed to the public. This is a copy of the behavioral reflex assessment conducted when Gavin Holt was still a candidate in the interagency coordination program with the CIA 5 years ago." A committee member glanced over and frowned. "An internal document? Verified and declassified for the sake of justice," Reagan replied immediately, leaving no room for doubt. "I did not bring it here casually. It was formally requested to be submitted last week." Gavin's lawyer started to speak, but Reagan raised her left hand lightly, as if drawing a line to cut off all rebuttals. "In this assessment," she continued, "Lieutenant Gavin Holt was confirmed as incapable of maintaining control reflexes when facing a non-compliant target, especially when racial emotional factors were involved. The conclusion is that he is unfit for duties requiring a balanced response. Specifically, simulated tests showed a tendency for excessive violent reflexes within the first 4 seconds if the subject was black, regardless of actual behavior." A committee member raised an eyebrow. "Is there a certified signature?" Reagan nodded. 2 agency experts signed off, one of whom still serves in the Tactical Psychological Evaluation Unit. Gavin said nothing. He stared at the file, his lower lip twitching slightly. The room was as silent as a chapel. The defense's just spoken shattered against the hard shell of undeniable truth. This was no longer a matter of subjective on-scene judgment, but evidence of a mechanism long warned about, yet ignored. For the first time in the hearing, Zion bowed his head, but only to conceal a tight smile, not out of triumph, but because for the first time, what he had felt in his bones was no longer a personal sensation. It was confirmed, documented, and recognized as a systemic failure, not an individual fault. A reporter seated near the door quietly sent out the first headline for the upcoming news segment, "CIA Assessment Reveals. Lieutenant Gavin Holt was previously warned about racial bias reflexes but retained his gun and badge." This time, no one disputed raising that question, because the system itself was beginning to answer. A federal investigator was invited to speak after a nearly 1-hour rebuttal session. He was Asian, slight in build, but his voice was steady, as if honed through hundreds of similar hearings. He presented briefly, without jargon or embellishment, just data, forensic video segments, and analyzed audio frequencies. He replayed the moment Gavin Holt forced Zion onto the metal chair outside the interrogation waiting room. Everyone had seen the footage before, but this time, the audio layers were separated, facial expressions highlighted, and an annotation showed the anger level on a communication reflex scale. The investigator pointed at the screen. The phrase, "This is your seat, forever," cannot be interpreted as a procedural command or risk suppression. It is a personal insult to dignity, imposed with bias and prejudice. We verified the file format, recording time, and metadata. The video is uncut, unedited, and no dubbing has been added. This is the original, complete recording. One committee member nodded, taking notes. Another sighed. The atmosphere was no longer a debate. It was a tension building from justice toward a systemic flaw once concealed. When asked to speak, Zion stood up. He didn't look at his mother or Gavin, his eyes fixed first on the committee, then on the audience, where strangers had silently watched from the start. "I hear that sentence every night in my head," Zion began, voice calm but unwavering. "Not because it hurts, but because it shows he never saw me as a person. He saw my skin color and found a place to discard me, as if I were something meant to be locked away forever." He paused. "And if an officer doesn't see me as human, then all your talk about procedure, process, evidence, or trial is meaningless. Why have a justice system if it's not built for everyone?" Outside the courtroom, dozens had gathered along the hallway. No chants, no banners, only raised phones sharing the video. The words just spoken by a 16-year-old spread like ink soaking through paper, overshadowing the many news pages that had once ignored similar cries for help. Reagan sat silently, hands resting on her lap, saying nothing. This was the moment her son spoke with his voice, and she knew that, no matter how many lawsuits followed, today would mark a milestone, not a victory, but a line no one would be allowed to cross again. Under the harsh white lights of the hearing room, the atmosphere thickened as the committee chair slammed a stack of files onto the table, his voice echoing through the prolonged silence. We demand a full review of the 12 arrests made by Officer Gavin Holt in the past 3 years. No further explanation was needed. The numbers themselves spoke volumes that everyone cautiously kept inside. 11 of those were black youths, mostly under 18. Not a single white person appeared on the list, and now, no one in the room had any reason left to pretend ignorance. Reagan showed no surprise. She leaned slightly, jotting a few notes in a thin notebook. Her movements were calm, without triumph, simply that of someone long accustomed to peeling away layers of dust others hurriedly bury. She knew these numbers were not just data but cuts, each case, each name, that had bled in real life. A young legal staff member was called to testify. She stepped forward slowly, eyes fixed on the floor, but once at the microphone, her voice hardened beyond her appearance. "I witnessed a boy around 14 arrested in the school hallway," she said. "Officer Gavin Holt handcuffed him there without stating a reason. When I asked, he looked at me and said clearly, 'If you want to keep this job, don't interfere.'" Those words pierced the veneer of what's often called internal procedure, and before a public committee, they carried the weight of a verdict already written. A committee member asked if she had reported the incident. She nodded. "I raised it with superiors, but was told not to pursue it further. They said the matter was resolved internally and I should focus on my duties rather than get involved in enforcement processes." The reason sounded administrative, but it was a way to legalize the cover-up. Reagan said no more, simply noting the school name and date before closing her notebook. Meanwhile, Gavin sat below, arms crossed, half-turned with a forced expression. He neither raged nor rebutted, but his silence was no longer a choice. It was a sign of someone losing control over the very story he tried to command. Zion watched the woman from the witness stand. He didn't need to thank her, nor did she expect it. Between them, one thing remained intact: the choice to stand for what is truly right. And now, that truth no longer lay in the hands of the police or the courtroom walls. It rose through testimonies, videos, and irrefutable records. Just as the hearing chair lifted a glass of water to his lips, Reagan's sharp voice cut through, like a blade flipping aside the dust of ethics. "Don't tell me it's a coincidence," she said slowly, eyes fixed on the files, "because in my profession, patterns are stronger evidence than any defense." She did not look at Gavin, but her words fell squarely where he sat like a boulder crashing onto dry concrete, where the first cracks in the system were beginning to show. A hush settled in the room with no wind, no sound except for pages turning and pens tapping lightly on the desk edges. Each person was marking something, not to look up later, but to remember. Habit can be invisible, but once exposed layer by layer, it grows more solid than any sworn testimony. And this time, Gavin Holt's habit was no longer a mystery. Suddenly, Gavin sprang to his feet, slamming both hands onto the wooden table, the crash echoing like an explosion in the dark. "This is a witch hunt," he roared, his cheeks flushed, lips twitching with unrestrained fury. "You're fabricating this. I'm being made the scapegoat in your filthy political game." His eyes darted across every face, devoid of his usual calm. His arrogance drained away, replaced by a raw, blinding anger, the kind that only bursts forth when power is ripped from hands that have held it too long. Gavin's lawyer rose immediately, stepping between him and the commission. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, striving to keep his voice low, though it trembled at first, "my client is in an unstable mental state. I request a suspension of this hearing to ensure fairness in these proceedings." He glanced swiftly at Reagan, then bowed his head, not daring to wait for a response. The presiding officer did not reply at once. He slowly spun his chair, his fingers tapping the table in time. "All right, let us take 15 minutes, he said. "But let us not confuse wounded feelings with the arrival of truth." He paused. "Truth does not come to please anyone." Reagan collected her documents into a slim folder, her hands steady, her gaze maintaining the necessary steel. To her, today's hearing was not merely about condemning Gavin, it was about proving that the habit of oppression is not a private matter. It has consequences, and those consequences cannot be delayed by a psychological excuse or by a desk slammed in uncontrolled rage. From the back of the room, Zion watched, his hands clasped lightly together, but his face no longer reflected the panic or fear of the first day. Perhaps now the truth was no longer a burden his mother had to carry alone. It had been spoken, It stood in the center of the room, and however much Gavin might scream, what happened today, finally, had emerged from the shadows of coincidence. It was the system. It had a name, and this time, someone had stood up and called it by name. The hearing was not over, but with each word spoken, with each name pulled from old files, the layers of power's dust were shedding. No one could brush it all away fast enough, and this time, they would have to bow before the ashes of their own making. In the room bathed in white light that covered every corner, silence became the backdrop for every carefully weighed word. A professor from Stanford University stepped up to the podium, carrying no thick files or long speeches, only a handheld projector casting a blue glow on the screen behind him. "I am not here to offer personal opinions," he began, his voice deep and steady like someone accustomed to facing controversy. "I am here with data." He pressed a button. A chart appeared, with the vertical axis showing levels of force used, and the horizontal axis representing the ethnicity of those detained. The red bars rose unevenly like broken steps. "In the past 3 years," he enunciated clearly, "the rate of police using excessive force is 3 times higher if the person detained is black, regardless of charges, age, or cooperation." He offered no further explanation. He did not need to. Each line on the chart, each disparity spoke louder than any speech. And if anyone in the room still believed in absolute fairness in law enforcement, that chart was a direct blow to that ideal. In the front row, Duke Morgan shifted uneasily, eyes scanning for an escape route, but the only door in this room was the door of truth, and it would not open for those standing on the wrong side of the line. When the hearing coordinator requested the display of text messages retrieved from Duke's phone, no one moved. Another screen lit up. The first message showed a conversation between Duke and another officer. "I thought he was a street vendor. Turns out he's the defendant. Gorillas know how to wear suits now?" The room fell silent. A text message, time-stamped, dated, and with the sender's name, was an indictment that required no seal. Reagan sat still, hands resting on her lap, face unchanged. But her eyes cut right through Duke's uniform, which he once used to shield the rot in his words. Zion stared straight at the screen, his eyes showing no surprise. For people like him, this was no shock. It was confirmation. Confirmation that everything he had endured, everything he had silenced and swallowed, was now laid bare in the light of day. An older member of the panel, older than both Reagan and the Stanford professor, set his pen down with a hoarse voice. "I have served in this field for over 30 years, but today I am ashamed of the uniform I once wore." He turned toward Duke, then Gavin, now bowed low in the defense seats, and said with measured words, "We don't need reasons anymore. We need limits. And you too have crossed those limits." The atmosphere in the room held no scent of gunpowder, no blaring sirens, yet it weighed heavily as if a major trial had just ended with an unspoken verdict. A precedent set by moral conscience, a declaration that no one could use the system to hide in its shadow any longer. The teenage boy sat silently in the courtroom, his back slightly hunched, hands gripping the edge of his shirt, as if loosening his hold would leave him nothing to grasp in the air, thickening with old memories. His name was Malik Andrews, 17 years old, once escorted by Gavin Holt into a holding cell in a case seemingly unrelated to violence. That day, Malik was arrested for throwing a small stone onto the sidewalk, a trivial act that in another neighborhood might have gone unnoticed. But here, with Malik's skin color and Gavin's control habits, it all became part of a process. Malik recounted the events without prompting, avoiding no detail. "He grabbed my arm, pulled me into the room. When I resisted, he slammed me against the wall. I screamed from the pain, and he said, 'If you want to get out of here, shut your mouth.'" His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes stayed fixed ahead, not seeking pity, but returning to the room what it had long lacked, the truth of those no one asked the name of. No one in the room demanded an apology from Gavin. He sat far off, hands clenched, eyes downcast, occasionally mouthing words he never spoke aloud. Some spectators turned away when Malik added, "I didn't know why I was arrested. I just remember being held face down on the table, no questions asked, no one told me my rights." He ended his testimony with a voice nearly hoarse. "I've never heard an apology from anyone." In that moment, Reagan was no longer just a mother demanding justice for her son, nor a federal agent with files and cold evidence. She stepped forward, stood before Malik without looking at anyone, then bowed deeply. "I apologize on behalf of a country that once forced mothers to learn how to defend themselves against their laws. Each word echoed in the crowded room, now utterly silent, as if the brick walls had absorbed every sound from the hallway outside. Malik blinked, his face softening for the first time during the hearing, not because he felt defended, but because, for the first time, an adult representing something greater than the system dared to take responsibility. The crowd exhaled softly behind him, an elderly woman wiped tears, and several reporters recorded every word, as if fearing that writing too slowly would lose something rare. The presiding judge did not intervene. He merely looked up at the ceiling, as if letting the apology quietly seep into every stone of the courtroom floor. It was not a ritual, nor a conclusion. It was the acknowledgement that those once called nameless needed to hear, even if only once. Zion sat quietly, eyes meeting Malik's. They nodded slightly to one another, a silent exchange of place in a history that never recorded their names. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted color through the tall glass panes, casting dappled golden light across the gallery seats, where, for the first time in many years, no one had to look down when hearing the words, "I'm sorry." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the large courtroom window, the golden light stretching across the wooden table where everyone present knew they had become witnesses to a moment that could no longer be hidden. The hearing had entered its fourth day, and tension had shifted into a quiet attention from all parties. Lawyers, police officers, veteran and young reporters alike. By now, the truth was no longer a question but a mighty river sweeping away every barrier once built with law, habit, or fear. In the front row, a gray-haired state legislator stood to speak. He held no notes, did not glance at his phone as usual. His gaze swept the room and lingered long on Zion, the young boy sitting upright beside his mother. "I must ask," he began, each word like a stone thrown into still water, "if today this boy did not have a mother like Mrs. Cross, would we be sitting here, publicly questioning, or would everything keep drifting along as it has for decades?" No one interrupted or showed dissent. Even those who usually scowled at politicians fell silent. That question, spoken by someone in power, echoed the loudest in the entire room. Zion listened fully, eyes on the legislator. He took a deep breath, hands folded in his lap, neither looking to his mother nor down. His lips pressed tightly before he spoke, voice clear enough over the microphone. "I don't want privileges," Zion answered slowly as if weighing every word. "I just want to be normal. I want to walk the streets, to stand in court waiting without anyone thinking I'm a criminal before there's a reason. I don't want a day when I see my mother stand up because I was handcuffed without doing anything wrong. I don't need her to be an agent. I need her to be my mother. And if I must choose, I hope every child here will only ever need their mother to be their mother, no titles needed." For a few seconds, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Those words passed along rows of desks, through a forest of microphones, quietly landing deep within everyone present. It was something that could not be refuted by argument or softened by reason. The longing to be ordinary when ordinary has become a privilege. From the left side of the room, an older woman rose. Her eyes were rimmed with dark circles, her voice trembling but resolute. "My name is Denise Allen," she said. "I live in the south of the city. 6 months ago, my son was arrested just for standing at a bus stop waiting for me to finish work at the hospital." All eyes turned to her, and without waiting for questions, she continued. "The police said he wasn't allowed to stand there because that area often had troublemakers. They didn't ask if he was waiting for someone or ask his name. They just cuffed him and held him for 4 hours until I arrived to explain." Denise paused, her hands gripping her bag strap tightly, as if holding herself up against a fall into the past. "When they released him, they didn't apologize. They only said, 'Don't stand there again,' and my son was only 13. Many in the room bowed their heads. Some closed their eyes or leaned back, trying to hold back tears or outbursts. Without many words, Denise's story answered the legislator's question. No one would sit here if outside the court today were not the son of a federal agent. No news would be written, no television coverage aired, if it were just a nameless black child. Outside the courthouse, the rain had just stopped, and the sidewalk was still dotted with wet patches. Crowds had gathered in groups. Some raised phones to film those entering and leaving the hearing. Amid the silent lines of people, a banner appeared, painted in white on a deep blue tarp. "If it takes the CIA to be heard, what about the rest of us?" The banner quickly spread across social media, appeared in evening news reports, was mentioned in televised commentary and became the shared question of thousands silenced for too long. The question was not for any single government, police department, or official. It was for the entire system in operation, for a society too accustomed to hearing only the loudest voices while smaller cries remain gray background noise. Zion stood by the window, watching the crowd outside, his gaze neither angry nor light but heavy and solemn. He knew he might leave this place and return to being a normal student, if lucky, but the shadow of this hearing, of the story of nameless children, would linger far longer than tomorrow's headlines. Somewhere across the street, he saw another boy looking back at that banner, a face unfamiliar, yet painfully familiar, like his own from days before. Reagan watched all these movements, no longer interrupting the flow of the story. She knew each word, each tear, each video would soon fade as new waves of news arrived. But what remained was a memory that could never be erased by those who had witnessed it firsthand. She sat beside her son, gently placing a hand on Zion's shoulder, softly as the first time she guided him through a crowded path, not to protect but to remind him, "You have the right to be normal, and I will keep saying that until every child believes it's true." Under the evening light, sirens slowly drowned out voices, but that banner remained visible, untouched. Deep inside the courtroom, where every question had just been raised, the answer still awaited. Does justice need power to speak? And if normal is a privilege, when will it become a right for all? The bright light in the hearing room shone directly down on Gavin Holt as the committee chair gave a subtle nod to invite him to speak. His voice came through the microphone, serious and steady. "Have you ever stopped to think that you might be wielding your power against the wrong person?" The entire courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Every piece of paper, every pen seemed to freeze in that moment. Gavin slowly raised his head, his eyes showing a rare flicker of confusion, yet his jaw clenched tightly and his lips remained sealed. The silence he held was heavier and more powerful than any explanation he could offer, like a concrete block pressing down heavily in the room. No one dared to break that silence, not even the committee members who had witnessed hundreds of hearings before. They remained quiet, waiting for him to confess, defend himself, or at least give some kind of reaction. But Gavin chose to let silence speak for him. He gripped his silence like it was his last shield, though this time that shield offered no protection against the mounting suspicion that had built up from his past actions. Reagan Cross then stepped forward, her every movement filled with a confidence forged through countless difficult encounters. She didn't look at Gavin, but instead fixed her gaze firmly on the committee and the audience, her voice calm but resolute. "The only silence I respect is that of the victim. Every other silence is complicity." Those 20 words rang out sharply like a warning bell, accusing every person in the room who had ever chosen to turn a blind eye or stay silent. All eyes immediately shifted back to Gavin, who maintained a cold and unreadable expression. The committee chair leaned in slightly, worry etching deep lines into his face. His expression mirrored the thoughts of everyone present. Silence cannot last forever, especially when the accusations remain unanswered. Those who once hid behind silence now faced the undeniable evidence that was waiting to awaken and speak for itself. Sitting quietly beside his mother, Zion Mercer rested his palm lightly on his lap, clenching it softly, as if to steady the rhythm of his heart. He wasn't surprised by the question from the chair, nor shocked when his mother spoke up. These were moments he had prepared for ever since stepping into the courtroom for the first time, the moment when justice, though delayed, would finally arrive through the undeniable language of truth. The hearing grew tense until the very end, when the investigation board chair publicly announced the decision. Gavin Holt was immediately suspended from duty, and all case files and related evidence would be transferred to the federal prosecutor's office for further investigation and prosecution if necessary. The gavel struck lightly, sealing an order everyone heard clearly but still sent a chill through the room. All eyes were fixed on Gavin, standing at the defendant's podium with a stunned expression, as if unable to believe the declaration. In the spreading silence, Gavin offered no objection, no defense, no plea. The suspension was not a final punishment, but the beginning of a sharper legal process, moving beyond state police jurisdiction and placing full responsibility on federal authorities. Like a bridge between two cliffs, the announcement drew a clear line between Gavin's past, where he once ignored abuse of power, and a future from which there was no turning back. Reagan Cross exhaled softly, a faint, encouraging smile playing on her lips. She knew many twists still lay ahead, but at least this time, the system revealed a serious intent to preserve justice. It was no longer theory, but firmly lodged within the federal legal machinery, where every move would be scrutinized and carefully weighed. Zion Mercer rose and stepped toward the microphone, his gaze free from hesitation. He looked directly at Gavin, without mockery or triumph, only profound understanding beyond his years. "It wasn't my mother who saved me," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. "It was his actions that brought him down." The brief statement struck the core. No miracles, no great power, just Gavin's mistakes and his misuse of authority that sealed his fate. Soft applause rippled from several members, not praise, but acknowledgement of a simple truth. The logic was clear. When someone acts from prejudice and abuse of power, their actions will be exposed and condemned, and no one can escape the consequences. Those who once remained silent and indifferent could no longer turn away. Gavin lowered his head, eyes reflecting the first hint of regret since the ordeal began. He glanced down at the files just handed over, containing a CIA psychological report warning of his behavior, camera footage, witness statements, and charts tracking his pattern of misconduct. Altogether, they painted an undeniable picture that exposed a habit of blind self-righteousness. Reagan turned to Zion, her eyes softening. He nodded, lending strength to his mother, then faced the investigation board. He understood his words were not a personal challenge, but a declaration for anyone marginalized by justice because of skin color or circumstance, that no one is truly anonymous, and no wrongdoing lasts forever unchallenged. As the hearing ended, board members quietly rose without rushing out. The courtroom returned to its usual calm, but every paper, file, and gaze carried the mark of a power shift, from abuse of authority to serious legal accountability. Outside, Zion and Reagan stepped through the large wooden door into morning light, streaming upon them. Their steps were gentle yet firm, as if they had shed invisible chains of injustice. A federal officer approached with a file, nodded briefly to Reagan. "We will continue the investigation," he said. Reagan nodded back, no words needed. Zion glanced at his mother, her hair brushing softly in the breeze. In his eyes, justice no longer felt distant, and through the brave voice of a boy speaking truth, paired with a mother's determined stand, justice had finally found its door to enter. The hearing seemed to be nearing its conclusion when another confidential document was brought to the table. A federal investigator solemnly opened an envelope stamped with the police department's internal seal and pulled out an old handheld recorder that everyone assumed had disappeared. "This is the original recording," he announced, capturing Officer Gavin Holt's words. As the recording played, the courtroom froze. Gavin's voice came through hoarse, clear. "I'm going to make sure Zion never holds his head up in court again," followed by a mocking, threatening laugh. Just a few seconds, but enough to strip away any chance of claiming it was mere talk. When the recording ended, one committee member quietly flipped the transcript page, confirming the timestamp matched the event record. All eyes turned to Gavin. He sat still, lips pressed tight, face suddenly pale. No apologies came, only the shadow of someone who once believed threats would never become evidence. Soon after, a technician labeled "Court Camera Support" was called forward. He carried a small laptop connected to the internal surveillance system. The hallway camera where Zion was dragged was disabled, he confirmed calmly. At the exact moment TVG2 stopped recording, but a bystander's phone video captured the entire incident. He displayed footage from that phone, showing Zion stumbling forward as he was dragged, eyes wide with shock and pain. Data from both sources, the audio and the civilian video, matched perfectly in angle, sound, and timing. Both revealed an undeniable truth. The proper procedure, Gavin claimed, was just a cover for abuse of power and intimidation. All excuses about maintenance shutdowns or sudden device failures were mere tactics to mislead the public and hide violations. Reagan placed a thick file on the table beside the recorder and laptop. She slowly opened to the first page, looking at the committee with calm yet firm eyes. "This is a summary report," she said, "documenting 23 personal rights violations by this state police department over the past 8 years. She flipped through the pages, each listing details of incidents, dates, victim names, breach procedures, and cover-up methods. Some involved unjustified stops and arrests, excessive force, handcuffs so tight that victims bled, and many others scrubbed from official records. Each number, each name, was like a brick breaking down the long-standing wall of silence. Reporters hurriedly took notes. Camera crews focused on the documents, while once confident faces now looked downcast or avoided eye contact. The room was thick with the scent of fresh ink and a sense that a small judicial revolution was starting. Meanwhile, Duke Morgan was summoned to the stand. He walked slowly, his face showing fatigue. When asked about his cooperation, he bit his lip, eyes avoiding the screen showing evidence. Finally, he looked up, voice trembling. "I admit my mistakes. I will cooperate for leniency." His admission lacked the word racism. He dodged it, as if never wanting to use it. He did not acknowledge racial bias, only a vague mistake. That stance caused some frowns among the committee, as it failed to admit the true nature of his actions. But at least it was a first step toward accountability. As Duke's silence settled, the committee quickly decided Officers Holt and Morgan would be suspended and their files forwarded to the federal prosecutor's office for further investigation with possible criminal charges. The decision was announced before the hearing adjourned. Everyone stood, files were gathered, cameras stopped rolling, and courtroom doors closed slowly. Reagan stepped down, gently embraced Zion without words. He bowed his head to her chest, arms wrapped around her shoulders. They spoke silently through their eyes, conveying that this fight was far from over. It only grew stronger each time the system tried to block the truth. Outside the courthouse, crowds still gathered, eyes fixed on the closed doors. The banner, "If it takes the CIA to be heard, what about the rest of us?" that fluttered yesterday was now captured from multiple angles with fierce commentary. The original bystander videos spread across dozens of platforms, serving as vivid proof that change could no longer wait for anyone else to act. Late that afternoon, as streetlights flickered on, Zion and Reagan walked down the damp hallway where power clashed with justice. Zion placed a hand on the cold stone wall, like a final period on a long silence. Beside him, the sound of their footsteps blended with keyboard clicks from outside, still recording every historic moment being written. In the space between those two courthouse walls, Zion's breath was no longer alone. It joined hundreds of awakened voices and thousands of startled souls in the light of justice. This story will be retold, not to seek revenge on an individual, but to remind that power, no matter how great, only truly matters when it serves human rights. When Carmen Cross, Zion Mercer, Malik Andrews, and dozens of other victims are seen, heard, and treated like people, only then does justice become something no one can ever silence again. The indictment was announced the very next morning, with the federal prosecutor's office formally charging Gavin Holt with systematic abuse of power, along with 2 lesser counts, unethical conduct, and obstruction of justice. The news spread like a tidal wave through public opinion, with the press at all levels calling it a landmark moment in state judicial history. Every detail in the indictment was drawn from the investigation file, from the audio recording of threats against Zion, the footage showing camera signal cuts, to the compilation of 23 violations of individual rights. On the front page of the local Gazette, a photo of Gavin in police uniform, eyes locked on the camera, was placed beside the bold headline, "When the uniform becomes a crime." Inside the police department, the news left many of his colleagues shocked or feeling pity for what had once seemed a stable career. The first hearing took place in a waiting room crowded with lawyers, reporters, and members of the former victim's family. Gavin appeared weary, his shirt wrinkled and his tie loose. He was denied a postponement due to media pressure, and after the charges were read, the judge upheld his bail on the condition that he avoid contact with any victims. While legal reports courts emphasized that punishment must come with accountability, many still saw Gavin as an outsider who abused power to trample on others. Zion Mercer, the eye of the storm, was never called to speak in court. He was pulled from the courtroom immediately after the case officially closed to protect his privacy and avoid media pressure. Though no public commendation was given, his record at the local police station was cleared of all wrongdoing. His administrative file status was changed to expunged due to federal intervention, and the name Zion Mercer disappeared from the subject system for over a year. That afternoon, he exited the courthouse through the back door, unnoticed by reporters, just a quietly opened door, and a child returned to a peace he had never known. Reagan Cross remained completely silent to all interview requests. She appeared one last time on the courthouse grounds, composed and carrying a handbag, passing through a storm of camera flashes. When a young reporter asked how she felt after the legal victory, she stopped, quietly met the gaze, and said simply, "A mother doesn't need cameras." Her words echoed across the damp stone plaza in the late afternoon, causing many reporters to hesitate, then look up, waiting for more. But she turned and walked away, leaving behind the final image of a mother who refused to make her child a public spectacle. News traveled fast to the local police department, where the police chief announced his resignation within the same week. Once a symbol of responsibility and discipline, he now faced public pressure and systemic abuse allegations, declaring he took full responsibility for the internal culture of cover-up and would hand over all duties to his successor. In a brief resignation letter, he wrote, "The community's trust has been deeply damaged, and only thorough change can save true justice." That afternoon, he closed the office for the last time, carrying out thick files and leaving the nameplate, "Chief," on an empty desk. It took several days before the internal procedures began to be reviewed. Civil oversight units were invited to check hallway cameras, and reports of unjustified detentions were brought before the State Human Rights Committee. An emergency training on civil rights and communication skills was held for all officers in the area. College law instructors opened free courses to the community, detailing dismissal rights, to hear one's charges, and to live without contempt. At a small house near downtown, Reagan and Zion returned to daily life. The teenager resumed school, carrying a bruise on his wrist as a lasting reminder. His mother received thank you letters from other mothers, from those who once stayed silent to protect their families. But she refused to read them, saying she only cared about teaching Zion a life lesson. The vicious cycle of injustice will only end when each person dares to speak up at the right moment, not just for themselves, but for those who have no voice. The story of Gavin Holt, Zion Mercer, and Reagan Cross became a reference for social organizations, a lesson on how power corrupts and how individual courage can break the chains of oppression. In the coming months, many other lawsuits were filed based on precedents at the intersection of legal privilege and civil rights. The media often repeated the banner outside the courthouse that day, "If it takes the CIA to be heard, what about the rest of us?" A reminder that power is not just for the titled, but belongs to anyone brave enough to speak out amid silence. And at the end of every article, there was often a hurried summary: "Justice has prevailed." But in truth, justice is not a destination. It is an ongoing journey of listening to small voices, seemingly faint stories, to ensure every voice has the right to be heard, no matter how much the powerful ear denies or conceals it. This story, as Reagan said, was not meant for cameras, it was meant for truth itself. 1 month after the hearing ended, an internal reform program was launched at the regional police department. Once quiet, small meeting rooms became open spaces, with chairs arranged in arcs for public discussion. The oversight board included community representatives, parents, human rights lawyers, and witnesses who had spoken out. They took turns attending trainings, surveying arrest procedures, and reviewing records. Every officer was retrained on civil rights, non-coercive communication skills, and accurate reporting. Workshops were now live-streamed on the department's website, with open comment sections for anyone to ask questions. Public interest quickly marked the broadcast schedule following each session, because everyone understood that power only becomes fair when scrutinized by those it serves. At the same time, local courts implemented new mandatory rules. Any interaction with minors, even brief questioning, required the presence of a defense lawyer or social worker. A large notice hung outside courtrooms black letters on frosted glass. All contact with persons under 18 must be accompanied by legal counsel or independent supervision. This regulation came after calls from parents and teens whose rights had been trampled. Smaller courtrooms were equipped with extra cameras, streaming directly to an outside monitoring room accessible to the community. Compliance reports were submitted regularly. Judges, prosecutors, and even escorting officers had to sign confirmations before each trial. At Jefferson High School, Zion Mercer walked through the red brick gate unnoticed. He carried no personal security, nor was he followed by reporters. His familiar light brown uniform and worn shoes remained his attire. He entered his classroom where the morning and afternoon light shone on the white chalkboard. His homeroom teacher, Mr. Raymond, held the attendance list, looked up, and smiled warmly. "Welcome back, Zion." Zion responded with a slight nod, glancing at his focused classmates. No whispers, no calling his name. Everything proceeded like a normal class after a long break. When the lesson started, Zion quietly sat in his old seat, opened his books, and immersed himself in the assignment like any other student. That weekend, Reagan Cross sat at a wooden table in the living room, yellow light illuminating a freshly written letter. Using blue ink, she penned solemn lines to the chair of the Special Investigation Committee. She summarized 2 relentless years seeking justice. "Thank you for no longer seeing my son as a statistic." No more words were needed. The letter was folded, placed in a locally stamped envelope, and dropped in the committee's mailbox. Her act was a ritual, closing a long chapter, but opening a new one for the whole community. None of these changes made headlines or were marked by street slogans, but they spread quietly through every glance. Young officers were reminded that crossing a child off the list was a crime, not a solution. Judges were advised to listen to testimonies not only with their ears but with their hearts. The public no longer turned away from stories of a black teen's rights being crushed. Now, they discussed reforms to ensure no one would endure that again. In the Jefferson School hallway, Zion stepped out after class, tapping a water bottle against his uniform sleeve. He watched his shadow cast on the brick wall, nodding slightly as if reminding himself of the long journey he had passed. Across the street, a group of parents stopped beside a community banner. The words, "Everyone deserves to be heard," pasted proudly. Zion dared not think about tomorrow, but knew for sure that today he lived as a normal child, not named by a crowd for crimes he didn't commit, not obeying orders imposed without explanation. Reagan exited the front door, carrying her bag, her eyes still reflecting concern for unfinished work. She knew the report sent was only the first milestone. Many files and silent voices awaited recognition. Yet she believed every handwritten letter, every community meeting, every return to class by Zion were bricks laying the foundation for a stronger justice. She gave him a tight hug, then let him walk ahead, unshielded, unheralded, to step into the world he always longed for, where a child simply could be himself and where power only truly mattered when it listened to the smallest voices. In a cramped community room with worn wooden chairs and faded green walls, illuminated by fluorescent lights, people gathered not for fame, but for a shared voice long buried through seasons. The workshop was led by local volunteers, with no famous speakers or grand introductions, just a microphone set center stage against a plain white backdrop, a table laid with water glasses and simple printed materials. All attention focused on the everyday stories few dared to tell. Police knocking on doors at night, the silent search for justice, fragments of trust left abandoned in courtroom hallways without anyone beside. Dozens sat shoulder to shoulder, backs straight, eyes fixed on the lone microphone. Some pressed their lips tightly, others clenched their hands, and some eyes glistened with tears. A boy placed on a raised platform, feet dangling above the floor, showed no fear. Not yet 16, he recounted how he barely understood the law, only that he was told not to touch cameras, not to ask questions, and never to argue with someone in uniform carrying a gun. "I don't understand the law," he began hesitant. but strong enough to drown out a ringing phone in his pocket. But I know what it feels like to be seen as a stranger, like I'm not here to be a person. The room fell silent at those words, needing no further explanation because everyone knew he meant the gaze of Officer Holt dragging Zion from the courtroom, a gaze that made him feel like a lost animal. Soft applause followed the boy's words, then others shared their tales. Each took the microphone as if reading from a torn diary. Nights of being stopped without cause, parents waiting outside precincts until dawn, tears spilled on dewy asphalt as unwanted guests in yellow light rooms. No spotlight or stage grandeur, just painfully real voices forcing listeners to breathe deep and swallow rising grief. Among the stories, an elderly woman with silver hair, shoulders bent by years, rose to speak. Her trembling voice echoed with emotion. I have lived long enough to know this trial is what we dreamed of when we wore homespun clothes. She spoke of hardship, of a time when poor children wore patched clothes to school, innocent yet never imagining the day the powerful would face their faults before the public. As she wept, the sobs mingled with creaking chairs, fragile as rice paper, fierce as long-buried hope. No music, no songs, only the hoarse cry of a life witness, silencing the room into attentive stillness. At the end, no honorary tables, no medal presentations, no official speeches. Against the simple stage hung a rough painting of wide-open eyes beneath a scrawled black message, "Look straight, then act." Eyes traced the brushstrokes, memorizing the final frame of visual proof. That message was not just for those responsible, but for every person in the room, because once you choose to truly see, you cannot deny what must come next. Afterward, people left in small groups, not looking back but not forgetting the boy's face, the elderly woman's figure, or the humble painting. Whispers followed them through the door. The court applied new rules. Police began internal reform. Black students outside Jefferson School were no longer eyed like criminals, and every encounter required a lawyer or supervisor. Change started with this winding workshop. No stars, just everyday people with earnest voices. Zion returned home, passing familiar gates, glancing at the painting of eyes on the television replaying old images. He sighed, knowing the fight for justice was no longer any one person's burden, but a community awakened. The courthouse walls, cameras, and indictments would fade, but today's workshop would remain etched in memory, not brilliant or grand, but strong enough to turn small voices into echoes that cannot die. As streetlights flickered on outside, people dispersed carrying photocopies of minutes, speeches, and the look straight, then act painting. They needed no marches, no fresh banners. Their footsteps had already been printed on sidewalks and hearts, and once printed, they cannot be erased. Every forward step is a vow not to repeat past silences, every page a living testament, and every clear gaze followed by action. The people's workshop ended, but the journey flowed on like an unstoppable river. Reagan Cross and Zion Mercer stood outside the courthouse, their shadows stretching long on the rain-soaked sidewalk. The crowd from the final hearing passed by them, faces less tense, less curious. Some glanced up at the mother and son, then quietly smiled, recognizing a parent no longer shielding power for her child. The courthouse doors closed tightly behind them. Footsteps inside softened, leaving a silent space for their emotional eyes. Zion lowered his head to look at his mother, the yellow street lamp light catching her neatly tied hair. Noticing her straight posture and calm, tireless eyes, he finally asked the question he'd long held. Will you go back to your old job? The scent of paper and computers lingered in memory, but now was the moment to choose a new path. Reagan smiled softly, her voice firm. Number, I will teach. The simple but decisive words stood for a commitment to a new journey. They no longer needed CIA titles or immunity. Now they only needed a chalkboard and a heart to pass on their fire to the next generation. They walked through the bustling afternoon streets, where no camera focused on them, no reporters swarmed, no microphones raised. Passers-by paused, their eyes quietly nodding, as if offering silent congratulations. A flower vendor bowed slightly as Reagan and Zion passed, and a delivery boy stopped to avoid collision, blinking kindly. These small gestures spoke a wordless language, conveying genuine appreciation without fuss. Zion felt no surprise at those looks, knowing these quiet eyes once pretended not to see or hear him when he was a child, dragged down courthouse halls with wrists tightly cuffed. Now he smiled and quickened his steps, shoulders no longer tense. Each step affirmed that human rights are not just declared in courtrooms but engraved in everyday acts and the goodwill of strangers. Their phones carried no evening news about this case, no official broadcast. Instead, hundreds of messages circulated in small chat groups. One message repeated, "Thank you for not being silent." These words appeared in parent groups, law student forums, and Black community chats. Each brief message carried deep gratitude, like a cloud bridging distance, connecting strangers united by a shared hope for equal justice. On the street, a sidewalk cafe served the scent of fresh bread and strong coffee. A few patrons sat outside, watching the mother and son stroll by, sipping coffee. They ignored the image of two figures playing roles in an event, seeing only two humans returning to their simple selves. Zion nodded to a group of high school students just released from class. They admired his gaze as if seeing themselves in his confident stride. When the public clock near the intersection struck 5, Reagan stopped and pulled Zion to a wrought iron bench in the small park across from the courthouse. He sat, breathing evenly, hands resting on the ornate ironwork. Reagan sat beside him, took a small postcard from her purse, smiled warmly, and handed it to Zion. On it was a drawing of eyes and scrawled words, "Look straight ahead, then act." She placed it next to him. "Keep this," she said, "to remind yourself why we started." He nodded and lightly touched the card, as if receiving the flame his mother passed on. They did not linger long on the park bench, only a few minutes to breathe the heavy air of power that once tried to silence every solitary voice. Then they resumed their walk, blending into the dispersing crowd of the late afternoon. Streetlights flickered on, reflecting on the wet pavement, creating shimmering streaks like traces of hope left behind. Around them, the world carried on with daily concerns. School buses rushed through intersections, workers hurried across streets, and shops began lighting up. But inside each person, something had changed forever. The belief that no matter how great the power, it is only a tool serving humanity. And whoever dares to speak out once, even if their story never airs on television, that story will live on in hundreds of messages, thousands of quiet nods, and tens of thousands of slow steps on an afternoon street, just like Reagan and Zion walking on, passing down hope that justice is not only found in courtrooms but spreads through every small act. The story of Zion Mercer and Reagan Cross did not end with fanfare or grand speeches, but with quiet footsteps toward the future. From the moment an officer abused his power to drag Zion from the courtroom, to the revelation of damning evidence, threatening recordings, hallway videos, corruption files, the fight became more than a lone voice for a forgotten minority. A mother's refusal to stay silent sparked an entire system to reflect, listen, and answer for its failures. That accountability did not stop at charging Gavin Holt or suspending Duke Morgan. It spread into new court protocols, revamped internal training, and community-led workshops. Rather than wait for distant reforms, citizens formed oversight committees open to all, where every voice was heard and respected. Through heartfelt sharing sessions, everyday stories told in trembling voices, children of color found their voices, no longer labeled potential threats. Stanford professors, state legislators, young prosecutors, and human rights lawyers all helped awaken the realization that when justice stops listening, procedures become mere paper. Yet the greatest lesson of this journey was the power of individual action. When Reagan dared to flash her CIA badge in a courthouse hallway, and when Zion met the camera's gaze to assert his right to live as a human being, they ignited change. The victim's silence earned respect and protection, while every other silence became complicity. In the old world, a mother was seen as too small to confront authority, and a black teenager was forbidden to speak out. Now, each step they took on afternoon streets, each handwritten letter to the commission, each grassroots workshop etched the portrait of a society refusing to crush its citizens' rights. No pageantry, no honors, just quiet, steadfast actions, standing up, speaking out, monitoring, and learning. Here, justice's value lies not in a final verdict, but in how it awakens each person. When thousands comment, "Thank you for not staying silent online," they praise courage and illuminate a vision of a community where every ordinary voice can touch another's heart. No pen or pedestal can give that. Only lived experience and real stories of handcuffed victims and their advocates can spark lasting change. When you hear another's story, sign a citizen's charter, join a local forum, or simply thank someone for speaking up, you plant seeds of hope. And with every such act, justice becomes not a distant goal but a path strengthened by our brave steps, each one a beacon guiding us through the darkness.